welcome to episode 6 of Culture Talks. We are Heather and Shaila, the regional managers of Crown's Global Skills team. I'm Heather, I'm based in the UK, and I oversee programmes in the EMEA and the Americas regions.
Hello, I'm Shaila, I'm based in Hong Kong, and I oversee programmes in Asia Pacific.
Each episode of Culture Talks, we want to pull back the curtain of cultural training, bust the myths, and do this with our own stories and examples on different topics each episode. We want to showcase the impact and the scope of cultural training.
Last episode of Culture Talks, we looked at the 3 top strategies to take from cultural training. This episode, we're looking at returning home successfully and the challenges and potential barriers you could face and which often get ignored, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're recording this in December. So it's a time of year that, you know, in a lot of countries around the world, there are a lot of celebrations, a lot of festivities where people are thinking about going home, maybe even just for a short time. But it really made us think about, you know, home from a cultural or cultural training perspective. And that's why we're doing this episode.
Right. And today's myth is that returning home, whether it's at the end of an assignment or even just for a short stay, like a holiday, is actually comfortable and easy, like slipping on an old pair of slippers, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, you know, how many of us, you know, it doesn't have to be just like at the end of an assignment or living abroad. How many of us have gone on a really amazing holiday or had like a really huge and exciting life event and then found it really super easy to just slip back into the daily routine, right? I know I definitely do not find that very easy to do. Or when you just find it really weird that something so massive has happened in your life, but everyone else seems to be just like going on as normal, and yet you feel so different.
Oh, yeah, I understand that. And we're going to talk about why it's so impactful in a personal and in business environments. You know, pre-COVID, it was generally accepted that people were 3 times more likely to leave their job after working abroad than average. So there's a real impact here, and why today we will really explore how going home is not really as simple as we may think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking a lot about going home. So we actually wanted to start by asking, like, where or what does home actually mean to you? And this was a really interesting question. It sounds really simple, but actually when you start to feel into it, quite a lot of us really struggle with this one. Shaila, what's home for you?
Okay, well, I have 2 homes, right? So I grew up in the UK. I've been living in Hong Kong for 20 years, and I keep saying, like, for example, I'm going home for Christmas, or I'm going home for the summer. It's confusing for me. I know that home is where my personal and my private space is, but I get it's kind of like a bit complicated, and you know, it's I guess it's somewhere where you've been all your life, kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So I think so. I've moved around, like as a kid, we moved around every 2-3 years, a lot as in my adult life as well. And I think for me, home is somewhere where I feel like settled and at peace. It's not an actual place. It's more of a feeling. So somewhere where I've maybe got roots, history. And it was interesting when we spoke to other people and we asked other people about it, they had the same sort of thing, that actually home is a place where family and friends are, rather than maybe where you are. And other people saying that if they were living abroad, it's a term that they use when they're talking about the country that's not the one they're in at the moment. So maybe that would be for you when you're in Hong Kong, that would be the UK for you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you hit the nail on that one, definitely. For me, so yeah, that's right. And in this industry that we work in, you know, global mobility, we call going home repatriation, right? So this is the phase at the end of an assignment. This part of the relocation cycle often gets neglected. You know, there's less support from companies given, and there's less emphasis. It's always about you going on assignment, but less about coming back home. And that, you know, and yet we talk about there's a big impact for companies losing their staff afterwards.
Yeah.
So today we're going to delve deep into the phenomenon known as reverse culture shock. Most people know about culture shock when you go abroad, but it's less discussed when you come back home. And this is what stops people from feeling like they've successfully returned home.
Right, absolutely. So let's dive in. So there are several different stages. So the first stage of like reverse culture shock is really one about like you're disengaging from where you are and preparing for where you're going. And, that's in an assignment, you maybe sort of like stop kind of making future plans, and you start sort of really focusing on all the things you're excited about where you're going. And even I think at the end of a holiday, sometimes you sort of just think, okay, yeah, I'm done. I'm ready to go home now. And so, yeah, it's really about like focusing maybe on your to-do list of going home, planning where you're going to live if you're coming back from assignment, who you're going to see, getting into that excitement of seeing friends and family. And that's what then leads you into stage 2. So these 2 stages are the ones I think that are the most recognized and the most sort of, commonly understood. Because stage 2 of reverse culture shock is the honeymoon period. That first period where everything is wonderful. Everyone is so excited to see you, and you're making loads of great plans to see friends and family that you haven't seen for ages. When I came back to UK, just the excitement of knowing that I was going to shop in shops where I liked the clothes and that they fit me, or like being able to go into a supermarket and just see pickled onion Monster Munch, or like the food that I had really missed. And that honeymoon for me also as well, like that honeymoon period was really all about like the senses. I just remember how fresh the UK smelt. Everything looked shiny. Walking into a pub felt amazing. Having a pint of cider was like the best thing ever. So yeah, it really just felt like everyone was friendlier. Like it was one of those, like, you'd see it on a film or something. It was just incredible. And that's the honeymoon period.
Oh, I understand. I get excited about the efficiency, things like, for example, trolleys that work properly. There's an organized structure.
You must be talking about going back to Hong Kong, right?
Of course, going back to Hong Kong, and things are organized. But then also when I'm in the UK, I love understanding the conversations with the supermarket when I can hear what the cashier is talking about, what was on TV last night. I feel included, and things just start to click, and that makes me feel really excited when I'm back home.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so lovely, isn't it? You just sort of feel like you can relax back into speaking really quickly and not having to sort of watch your language, like using sarcasm or just like phrases from where you're from. And I think that you're also like relaxing back into those cultural values within the language, that we talked about in episode 4. But it can come with a flip side. Like when I first came back from Taiwan, I remember my mum via like getting home, my mum took us to the Asda in Gloucester. Big shout out to the Asda in Gloucester. But I actually had a funny turn because of this massive sensory overload. I could understand every conversation that was going on around me. I could read everything in front of me, and my brain had just stopped processing information in that way. So I had to go and sit with the old ladies at the end of the checkout and like recover, because my brain was processing so much. It was really interesting.
Wow, that sounds like a real turn you had there. So the place where you feel like yourself, that's what you're trying to say, like, where you feel like you're really being you, right?
Yeah.
Well, the next stage we talk about in reverse culture shock is the dip, the irritability and the hostility you feel. The culture shock hits first, and then you realize you have to relearn how to fit back in. Here's where we want to bust the myth that going home is comfortable, really quite easy. Well, during this stage, frustrations start to kick in, and you're on that roller coaster of emotions, finding yourself having to readjust. And it might start with something really small, like, for example, people who've moved back from the UK after living in the US notice like a little bit of friction and frustration at differences in customer service standards. They find themselves having to consciously dial back and tone down what has become normal behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting, because I think when we're away from home, we do tend to focus on the good bits from our past and like from home, and we kind of cut out the bad and gloss over the bits that we weren't so amazing. We create this like idealized version of home, and it's an idealized version that hasn't changed. So where you're adapting, but you're just in your head, home is staying the same. So that's when like the bad and the new parts that you weren't expecting, because you sort of don't think it's going to change, become really confronting, and you feel very other, and that otherness is odd in your home country. And so for me, when I moved back to the UK after 9 years of being abroad, I wanted to change industry, and I really struggled because so much changed. Like there were so many new qualifications, and I spent a lot of time being really frustrated and feeling like everything in the job market had become very, very constrained. Everything was very regulated. It was very different to what I started to think back to where I had been, and really the freedom of what was possible. And really, I felt very angry with the UK, but I also just expected myself to get it. I was not expecting to have to learn the job market and where I fitted in. That was really quite confronting.
And we see that, right? I mean, changing roles, when you come back home, it's very common in the corporate world. It's hard to get back into the office environments, and the teams that you're working with, they have expectations, and there's
Yeah.
always this hidden stress of needing to redefine yourself with your international experience, whilst fitting back into the
Yeah.
office, and colleagues who stayed in the country as if nothing happened really. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
difficult for companies to support and retain people once they've returned, unless they can capitalize on international experience. It's
Yeah.
hard, that lack of connection with your colleagues.
Yeah, it really, really is. And it sort of begs the question, isn't it? Is there a responsibility if a company has sent someone abroad? Is there a responsibility to support them when they move home? And, I was really lucky because I didn't move with a company. So I was supporting myself, but I was also just supporting myself. I didn't have anyone else to think about.
Right.
I could just go and, focus on like what I need to do and what I needed to be able to like reassimilate. But actually, there's when you move with a partner, you move with children, there's just so much more support that's needed for them as well.
Absolutely. So where there's support for the relocating partner, as you said, but also imagine, like the children, right? They go to international schools, and then they're coming back to change into a local school system. And,
Mm,
sometimes they have to do exams to get into the schools, and there's a lot of pressure going on. And, when families make that decision to repatriate, the children don't even have a connection with anybody back home. So it's even more stressful for everybody involved.
yeah, totally. And this happened to me. I didn't live in the UK until I was 8. I was born in Taiwan. So I was actually what we call a third culture kid. And
Hmm.
moving to the UK, this was like, another new country for me. And yet, I had been raised to believe I was British. So yeah, that was quite hard. Kids were talking about cartoons that I didn't know. And, you know, I had to repeat a year at school. Like the schooling system was very, very different. And my maths, I mean, you could argue that that is just my maths. But, because of my maths wasn't following the same system, I repeated a year at school. So it did have an impact on me. And I actually also remember, we'd moved around and we'd been abroad for my dad's job. And I remember coming back into the UK, and where one of the first places we lived, my mum hated it. And she actually still hates that place in the UK now. And I actually wonder if it was the stress of this stage that actually really impacted that.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure
Mm,
it was, because, there is a real psychological impact of returning home. There's that, again, we talk about that hidden stress of not understanding or getting it. So when you
mm.
go home, you look and sound the same as others. So other people don't really have the time to explain or support you in any, the same way you might be if you knew someone was from another country, like a tourist, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like if you see a tourist, somebody who's clearly a tourist with a map, you're likely to go and help them, right? But if I saw someone,
Mm.
who was British who had a map, I wouldn't necessarily feel like I, needed to go up and support them. So yeah, it really is. It's very interesting, like having to try and work out how to reintegrate into friendships, into society, where do I fit? Because, like I constantly had to ask my question, like, how much do people really want to hear? And actually, what I was
Mhm.
finding is people didn't really want to hear like what my stories were, because they were so different. And that all continued to create this otherness. I found myself having to really monitor myself, because I was trying to fit back into my old ways, but I wasn't that person anymore. I always think about that first really awful, wet, muddy British winter. And I was
Mm.
wearing a coat that I'd left at my mum's house. And it was a coat that I bought 10 years ago. And it was so symbolic. Like everybody else was 10 years ahead. Like I was 10 years behind. Everyone else had got like better career progression. They'd bought houses. They'd got married. Like I really had this like very angry story that I had created this situation where I was 10 years behind.
And I bet you were critical as well of everyone back home.
Oh, 100%. I apologize to the British public. I was very angry. Yeah, I really very critical about what's going on, politically, as well as just sort of generally like people's attitudes. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, there's studies out there that it is confusing when you're going back home, and it's isolating, and it can be exhausting, and this can actually lead to depression in some
Mm,
cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final stage of reverse culture shock is actually the bit that you would assume you'd get to kind of, quickest. And that's the acclimatization, sort of accepting and settling in and really feeling like you are like back home. And this stage can take much longer to get to than you might expect. It can be from 6 months to years. I remember having been back in the UK for 3 years and still having moments of feeling really, really other and just really observing what was happening and thinking, what is this? So, but what can we do with this? We wanted to talk about returning home successfully in this episode. And, we've discussed the dip and how that can really stop people from feeling successful when we return home. But what can we really do about it?
Well, I guess we could look at the tips from the last episode
They were good ones.
They were, right? We talked about pausing, slowing down and looking deeper. And really, notice that stress. Don't be afraid of like recognizing it. And also try and make those small shifts in your behavior. Talk about it with others and call it out, explain to others how you're feeling. Like if you've got post-holiday blues, talk about it. If you're going through reverse culture shock, talk about it. Realize that you're going through a recognized cycle of emotions and behavior, and be aware of, the fact that you're not alone. And it can only get better, right?
Yeah, it definitely does get better. And even like from a corporate perspective, what could you do within a company if you're relocating back? You could look at having, some repatriation training or coaching, something like retaining, a home country mentor, so that you stay up to date with what's going on like in your industry back in your home country potentially. So yeah, there are things to do and it certainly does get better. But yeah, so today, I hope we've shown that the idea that going home is not like putting on an old pair of slippers. Maybe now your feet have grown, maybe you don't even like slippers anymore. Going home carries such an expectation that things will be much the same, but you have changed. So as ever, our lovely audience, we want to leave you with a question. Let's go back to that question we asked at the beginning. What does home mean for you? And then have you ever experienced a dip, some frustration after a big and possibly life-changing event? What did you do about that? So thank you so much for listening. Shaila, it is always a joy. Join us next time for episode 7 of Culture Talks.